Four Europeans go hiking together, and they get terribly lost. First they run out of food, and then out of water. "I'm so thirsty," says the Englishman, "I must have tea." "I'm so thirsty," says the Frenchman, "I must have wine." "I'm so thirsty," says the German, "I must have beer." "I'm so thirsty," says the Jew, "I must have diabetes." Like many jokes, this one has serious implications. Ruth Weiss, in her analysis, notes the following. While the three hikers react to the problems at hand, the Jew anticipates its direct implications. The three want to quench their thirst, and he looks for complications behind the presumably obvious cause. Is he neurotic? A hypochondriac? Why is he conditioned for disaster? The joke may know what happened to the Jews of Europe and may assume that a Jew in European company is entitled to worry about his prospects of survival. In other words, because of our history, we come by our insecurities honestly. When Tevye of Fiddler on the Roof fame prepares for his community's expulsion from their beloved Anatevka, knowing that as Jews they have always had to be prepared for that moment, he comments, "This must be why we always wear our hats on our head." So in the face of our colossal, yet understandable insecurity as a people, what's the secret of our success? Yes, we must admit to success in remaining part of history for so long, for having achieved so much in every recognizable field of human endeavor, notwithstanding the myriad of obstacles we faced through the ages. How did we do it? How did we withstand such pressures, such challenges, such torment through the ages, and still somehow remain in history when actuarial logic might have suggested otherwise? The answer may be suggested in an intriguing Mishnah in Tractate Brachot. Chayav adam levarech al hara'ah kishem shehu mevarech al hatova. One has to say a blessing for the bad, just as one says a blessing for the good. A practical manifestation of this difficult Mishnah, familiar to many of us, is the blessing that we recite traditionally upon hearing of a death and when performing the ritual of kriyah, of cutting the clothing or the ribbon before the funeral of an immediate family member. Baruch Dayan Ha'emet, praised be the true judge. I was reminded of this Mishnah some time back during a visit to Baycrest, heading to a congregant's room in the Apotek Center. I walked by a man who was in his wheelchair, parked in the hallway. I smiled at him, I said, "Hi." I said, "Was macht ihr? How you doing?" He looked up at me with a wry smile, and he answered, "Thank God, lousy." Obviously, I felt bad for him and his predicament. Clearly, he was not living the life the way he wanted, the way he remembered. Maybe a year or two earlier, he was still able to get in the car, drive to visit his grandchildren, meet his friends at the bagel restaurant. And now he was stuck in a chair, dependent upon caregivers, bored out of his mind. I did feel bad for him, but I did admire his spirit. His thank God lousy was his fulfillment of levarech al hara'ah, his blessing over the bad, his spirit preserving his moral and intellectual dignity. Chayav adam levarech al hara'ah, the Mishnah teaches, we have to find the wherewithal to find blessing even in bad times, for our sake and for that of those around us, who will also need strength to see them to better days. An early model of persistent faith, some 2,700 years ago, was exhibited by King Hiskiyahu in the book of Isaiah, from which we read a bit earlier, and also in Sefer Melachim, Book of Kings. There's a description of Hiskiyahu being stricken with a severe illness. The prophet Isaiah comes to pay him a visit, but his words are less than comforting. Set your affairs in order, the prophet tells him, because you're going to die, you're not going to survive. But Hiskiyahu refused to listen to the prophet. He refused to prepare to die. Rather, he turned to God in prayer and he said, Ribono shel Olam, remember how devoted a servant to you I have been. Remember, please, don't let this happen to me. Then God, through Isaiah, tells the king, I've heard your prayer. I see your tears. I'm adding 15 years to your life. Our sages in the Talmud fill in some of the details for us. Isaiah delivers his harsh message, and then we learn the king turns to Isaiah and says, Kalei nevuatcha v'tzei, loosely translated, finish your prophecy and get the hell out of here. I've been taught, according to the rabbis, the king says, that even when a sharp sword rests on one's throat, al yibana atzmo min harachamim, he should not despair of God's mercy. He can't lose hope. He can't give up. It's taken me a while to get to today's parasha of Eikev, which included a very unusual pasuk, a very interesting verse. Kol ha-mitzvah asher anochi mitzavcha hayom tishmerun la'asot, all the commandment, singular, which I command you, plural, this day, shall you observe to do them, that you may live and multiply and go in and possess the land which the Eternal swore unto your ancestors. The early 18th century commentator, Rabbi Scheim ibn Attar, known as the Or HaChaim, he explained the peculiarity in this verse, going from singular to plural. The word mitzvah is singular, suggesting in his view that each individual commandment, each singular act that a Jew performs, makes him or her part of the plural, part of the totality of Jewish life, an inseparable part of Jewish tradition and of the eternal Jewish people. In order to understand better the impact that every single mitzvah, that every Jewish ritual and practice has had upon Jewish generations, I refer you to a series of books in Hebrew entitled She'elot u'Tshuvot Mima'amakim, abridged and translated into English under the title Responsa from the Holocaust, Rabbi Ephraim Oshry, who I had the privilege of meeting in his apartment in the Lower East Side of New York in Manhattan in the late 1970s when I was a rabbinical student. Because if you wanted to buy his books, he had to meet with you, and he would sell them to you personally. And I've treasured those far more than anything I possess. And so Rav Oshry, in his collection, places before us the questions that were addressed to him during the years of the Shoah and immediately thereafter, in his role as the Rav of the Kovno ghetto, and his answers to those she'elot, those questions. The answers there are moving, they're insightful, but it's the questions that have the power to move mountains. Rav Oshry was asked in the Kovno ghetto in 1943 if one was permitted in the ghetto to recite the traditional morning blessing, thanking God, Shelo Asani Avid, for not having made me a slave when in fact they were slaves. How can a slave recite the blessing of a free person while we are in captivity, he was asked. And this is how he answered. He said, one of the earliest commentators on the prayers points out that this bracha, this blessing, was not meant to praise God for our physical liberty, but rather for our spiritual liberty. I therefore ruled, he writes, that we may not skip or alter this blessing. On the contrary, despite our physical enslavement, we're more obligated now than ever to recite the blessing, to show our enemies and to show ourselves that as a people, we remain spiritually free. Rav Oshry's answer reminds me of a personal experience in the former Soviet Union 4.5 decades ago, where I was seated at a crowded Seder table in a dingy Moscow apartment, surrounded by refuseniks, scientists, mathematicians, linguists, all of whom had lost their jobs applying for visas to Israel, some of whom had been imprisoned for studying or teaching Hebrew. I remember Yuli Kosharovsky, alav shalom, who led the Seder, reciting the words, Hashata haba hacha, Lashana haba ba'arad Yisrael. Now we're here next year in the land of Israel. Hashata avdei Lashana haba b'nei chorin. Now we are slaves. Next year, free people. I remember Yuli smiling slightly as he read the words, which I understood at that time as recognition of the slavery they were then experiencing. Only then did it occur to me, as Rav Oshry understood in his tshuva, that these were the words of the spiritually free. Their bodies were still trapped in the Soviet Union, where they would be forced to remain for several more years until finally their dream would be fulfilled and they would arrive in Israel. At that time, their bodies were still enslaved, but their spirit had already long before made it to Yerushalayim. That's where faith comes in. It has not always been easy. That may be the greatest understatement in history. Sometimes it's been excruciatingly difficult to keep that hope alive, to believe that after the Shoah there could be liberation, that after war there could be a Jewish state, that after imprisonment and refusal there could be freedom for Soviet Jews, that after all that has befallen us throughout our long and so often blood-stained history, that we would have outlived as a people so many of those regimes that sought our destruction. Faith taught us never to give up hope in a better tomorrow. It took so many Jews who tried somehow to cling to pieces of their tradition when their entire world was in tatters. It took them to keep us in readiness for a time in history, for today, when, for example, more prayer books, more Hebrew texts, more Jewish writings of all kinds are in print than in all of the centuries of accumulated Jewish history until now. Imagine this scene. In the Warsaw Ghetto, a building, a shtibel, small shul. Outside of the building, above the entrance, an inscription bearing the words of Rav Nachman of Bratslav, Gewalt jeden seid sich nicht miayish. Jews, for heaven's sake, don't despair. One's first response to such an inscription is amazement. Telling Jews not to despair in the Warsaw Ghetto, of all places? How can one in such a place help but despair? But think about it a little longer. The words do make sense. The words appear above the entrance to a synagogue, to a place of prayer and study. One who would read the words, Jews don't despair, and walk by them would be unlikely able to relate to them in any significant way. But one who would read them and then walk under them into the shul on which they appear and there engage in tefillah, in prayer, in Talmud Torah, in study, they would indeed be demonstrating a refusal to despair. You can't daven and despair at the same time. Prayer, like any act of faith, defies hopelessness. Our prayer, by its very words, by the direction in which it is recited, it defies despair at times such as these. Faith, tradition, prayer may have been the last remaining hedge against despair. They may have preserved a last vestige of sanity in a world gone insane. True. Time has taken its toll on our people. But what we've learned in the experience of the last 8 decades, if not throughout our long history, is that we have had staying power. We've had a resilience, a determination that lamarot hakol, that notwithstanding all the tribulations that fill the pages of our past, we have not succumbed to despair. Just as the seeds of the destruction of half of our people were being planned in the early years of the 20th century in what would become Nazi Germany, at that very moment in history, the sands north of the city of Yaffo were being shaped into Tel Aviv, the first new Jewish city in 2,000 years. The words obviously are not mine, but they're those of Naftali Hertz Imber that I trust all of us know and will always hold on to. Od lo avda tikvatenu. Notwithstanding everything, our hope isn't lost. Remember always that we are the people of hope, the people never resigned to despair. In last month's issue of Commentary magazine, Rabbi Meir Soloveitchik writes, a recent New York Times article features an interview with Omer Shem Tov, who until recently was held in cruel captivity in Gaza by Hamas. Omer, the Times tells us, had grown up in a largely secular home and was living a relatively carefree existence after completing his compulsory military service. Then on October 7th, 2023, he was suddenly snatched and subjected to torture in cramped surroundings for a year and a half. It was as a hostage that Shem Tov embraced the faith of his ancestors. A few days into his captivity, he said, he began to speak to God. He made vows. He began to bless whatever food he was given. And he had requests, some of which he believed were answered. You're looking for something to hold on to lean on, Omer Shem Tov said. The first place I went to was God. I would feel a power enter me. Faith kept me going, he said. I always believed that I would get home. I didn't know when or how. Omer Shem Tov's embrace of Jewish observance was not limited to prayer. We're further informed that he decided to keep kosher as much as he could, eating either the cheese or the canned meat which they were given, but never together, in line with Jewish dietary laws prohibiting mixing meat and dairy. The Times article concludes by describing how Shem Tov promised God, well, were he to get home, he would pray daily with tefillin. And the article features a photo depicting Omer Shem Tov doing just that. Chayav Adam levarech al hara'ah. Yes, we're obligated, the mission teaches us, to find faith, hope, and even to offer blessing in bad times, in moments of darkness, fear, and pain. 9 days from now, evening and morning, from the first day of Elul until Shmini Atzeret, we're going to end our services morning and night with the 27th Psalm. And its words offer comfort and hope, especially important during these continually very challenging times for the Jewish people and for Israel. Hashem uri v'ishi, the Lord is my light and my help, mimi ira, whom shall I fear? Hashem ma'os chayai, mimi efchad, the Lord is my strength of my life, whom shall I dread? Shema Hashem koli ekra, chaneni v'aneni, O Lord, hear my voice when I call, be gracious, answer me. Ezrati ha'ita, you've always been my help. Al ticheni v'al ta'azveni, Elohei Yishi, don't forsake me, my God, my deliverer. Kavei Hashem, chazak v'yemetz libecha, trust in God. Take courage, be strong. Kavei Adonai, continue always to hope. Never relinquish that hope. That's what has kept us here this long, and that's what will keep us here, Bezrat Hashem, into eternity.